Okay, today we are going to read basically the rest of 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles. I might leave the last paragraph or so of each text for later. We're also going to read the books of Habakkuk and Obadiah, two very short minor prophet books. So we're going to be starting today in 2 Kings 23, at the beginning of the chapter. We have read the first half of the account of King Josiah, how he came of age. He came to the kingship at age 8, gradually began following the Lord as he got older, started in his 8th year when he would have been 16, and continued on. Then in his 18th year, was it his 18th year? Yeah, the 18th year, when he was 26, they renovated the temple, and in the process of doing so, they found a copy of the Law of Moses, at least Deuteronomy, maybe the whole account, maybe the whole Pentateuch, the first 5 books, Moses' books, maybe, at least Deuteronomy. We don't really know exactly. But they found something that they had lost. They had access to a part of the written Word of God that they had not had access to, at least for decades. Sometime during the reign of Manasseh, presumably several decades earlier, these copies were lost, hidden maybe misplaced, maybe, I don't know. No one knows. The text doesn't really say. But it was information, word, revelation from God that Josiah did not know about, that the people of his day did not know about, because it had been lost, at least for a while, at least for a generation at that point. So they took it, they read to the king, he was moved, he repented, he tore his clothes, he sent them out for insight and counsel, which they found in the form of a prophetess, a female prophet named Huldah. She gave them the word from the Lord, and then Josiah has now called for a national repentance and renewal of the covenants. That's what we're going to read about here in 2 Kings 23. The previous line, the final sentence of the previous chapter was, they took her answer, the king's advisors took Huldah's answer back to the king. Then the king called together all the elders of Judah and Jerusalem. He went up to the temple of the Lord. With the men of Judah, the people of Jerusalem, the priests and the prophets, all the people from the least to the greatest. He read in their hearing all the words of the book of the covenant, which had been found in the temple of the Lord. The king stood by the pillar, and I don't know what pillar this is. I mean, some architectural feature of their temple area, and renewed the covenant in the presence of the Lord, to follow the Lord. This is capital L-O-R-D, Lord, so Yahweh, the covenant name of Jehovah, Israel's God, to follow the Lord and keep his commands, regulations, and decrees with all his heart and all his soul, thus confirming the words of the covenant written in this book. Now, that goes back to the main promise, command from Deuteronomy 6. Love the Lord your God. Deuteronomy 6 verse 4. The Shema, the prayer. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. That, of course, is what Jesus calls the greatest of the commandments. So we know that he's probably reading at least from the book of Deuteronomy here. And all the people pledged themselves to the covenant. The king ordered Hilkiah, the high priest, the priests next in rank, and the doorkeepers, to remove from the temple of the Lord all the articles made for Baal and Asherah, and all the starry hosts. He burned them. I don't know how many were still in there, but they, I guess, went in and got them all, I guess. He burned them outside Jerusalem, in the fields of the Kidron Valley, and took the ashes to Bethel. Now, Bethel is up in the north. This is the southernmost part of the old northern kingdom of Israel, It's only a few miles north of Jerusalem. So he's going up to the former Israelite territory, which was where they had one of their major worship sites when Jeroboam set up the worship sites at Bethel and Dan way back 300 years earlier. So he's going there with these ashes of these idols and other things that they burned up that had been littering the temple. He did away with the pagan priests appointed by the kings of Judah to burn incense on the high places of the towns of Judah and on those around Jerusalem, those who burned incense to Baal, to the sun and the moon, to the constellations, and to all the starry hosts. So he did away with them. They're not getting another chance. They're done. They're finished. And that's according to the law. Again, going back to Deuteronomy, which Josiah now has a copy of and is fresh in his mind. Deuteronomy 13 has a whole lot of provisions about what to do with idolaters. I'll read just some of them. If a prophet or one who foretells by dreams appears among you and announces to you a miraculous sign or wonder, and if the sign or wonder of which he has spoken takes place, that he says, let us follow other gods, gods you have not known, and let us worship them, you must not listen to the words of that prophet or dreamer. One of the tests of a prophet is whether or not what he says comes true. If what he says doesn't come true, he's prophesying falsely. In this case, what he said did come true. Whether it was a lucky guess or maybe an educated, assumption based on the way he thought things were going to unfold, maybe he had even a direct revelation from God. God did sometimes speak to prophets who turned out to be false prophets. And we saw that before with Balaam in Numbers, and for example, God did sometimes call men to be prophets, and those prophets ended up going bad. That did happen some. So who knows? But whatever he said did come true. But he still says, let's worship other gods. You must not listen to the words of that prophet or dreamer. The Lord your God is testing you to find out whether you love him with all your heart, with all your soul. It is the Lord your God you must follow, and him you must revere. Keep his commands and obey him, serve him, and hold fast to him. That prophet or dreamer must be put to death, because he preached rebellion against the Lord your God. And he goes on to say the same thing about your own family members, your brother, your son, the wife that you love, your closest friend. If any of them secretly entice you, saying, let us go and worship other gods, gods you have not known, gods of the people around you, whether near or far, from one end of the land to the other, do not yield to him or listen to him. Show him no pity. Do not spare him or shield him. You must certainly put him to death. Chapter 17, it's a little bit later, starting in verse 2. If a man or woman living among you in one of the towns the Lord your God gives you is found doing evil in the eyes of the Lord your God in violation of his covenant, and contrary to my command has worshipped other gods, bowing down to them or to the sun and the moon and the stars of the sky, and this has been brought to your attention, then you must investigate it thoroughly. If it is true, and it has been proved that this detestable thing has been done in Israel, take that man or woman who has done this evil deed to your city gate and stone that person to death. On the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses, a man shall be put to death. But no one shall be put to death on the testimony of only 1 witness. So there was a specific law saying that if someone is enticing the Israelites to follow other gods, you must stone that person. You must put him to death. That's what Josiah is doing that. He is taking these men who have been appointed as priests, probably not legitimate Levitical priests, probably just men who were appointed to be priests. We saw this back in Jeroboam, way back at the beginning of the split kingdom. Jeroboam invented his own priest class and basically let anyone be priest who wanted to be priest. And this was not unusual, okay? In fact, the fact that the Israelites having a dedicated priestly tribe would have been unusual for that point in time. In the past, it was usually the firstborn son's responsibility to be sort of like the family priest or head of the family religious responsibilities. That's why they had a fight over that back in the days of Noah and the Korahite rebellion. They wanted to have those privileges back because that had been what they were used to. The idea of the firstborn son as a preeminent member of the family who gets to be essentially the officiating priest for the family. And that became irrelevant when God took the Levites for that role instead, the Aaronic branch of Levites in particular, to be priests and did not allow anybody else to be priests. Whereas in this culture around them, that was not the way it was usually done. So Josiah is fulfilling his actual obligations here to do what the law requires and eliminate, dispose, stone, put to death these pagan priests. Josiah took the Asherah pole from the valley of the temple, from the temple of the Lord to the Kidron Valley outside Jerusalem and burned it there. He ground it to powder and scattered the dust over the graves of the common people. He also tore down the quarters of the male shrine prostitutes, which were in the temple of the Lord, and where women did weaving for Asherah. So I guess they made some sort of clothes or robes for Asherah. Not entirely certain what that means, but they're weaving some sort of cloth or fabric or clothing or something that has something to do with Asherah, the goddess Asherah. Asherah, of course, being the female consort of the god Baal. They were fertility gods. Baal was the storm god. Asherah was the goddess of the land. The storm god fertilized the mother goddess, the earth goddess, and produced fertility. And so to worship them properly, you had sex. Basically, that's why they have male shrine prostitutes right there in the temple. Okay? It's because the proper worship of Baal and Asherah was basically licensed, sanctioned sex. That's why it was so popular. Josiah brought all the priests from the towns of Judah and desecrated the high places from Geba to Beersheba, where the priests had burned incense. Now, these are not the pagan priests we just got done mentioning. These are legitimate priests who were conducting worship for the sake of God, but they were doing it at these high places, which they weren't supposed to do. This is still outside the law, but it is not as severe a crime as the pagan priests that were burning to Baal and Asherah. He broke down the shrines at the gates, at the entrance to the gate of Joshua, the city governor, which is to the left of the city gate. Although the priests of the high places did not serve at the altar of the Lord in Jerusalem, they ate unleavened bread with their fellow priests. So they were allowed to live, but they could not serve at the temple any longer. They were basically unclean. They would have been essentially the same as priests who had a physical defect or something along those lines. But they were not put to death like the pagan priests had been. They were allowed to live, but they were not allowed to serve at the temple. He desecrated Topheth, which was in the valley of Ben Hinnom, so that no one could use it to sacrifice his son or daughter in the fire to Molech. Now, we're going to read more about this when we get into the book of Jeremiah. Jeremiah, in fact, is going to have an entire section devoted to cursing this location. But essentially, outside of Jerusalem, on the southwest side, there's actually kind of all around the city, there are these valleys. And to the southwest of the city is a valley called the Valley of Ben Hinnom, which means the Valley of the Sons of Hinnom. Ben is the Hebrew word for son. So it means the Valley of the Sons of Hinnom. Presumably, Hinnom was somebody who once owned this land, and his sons either sold it to the Israelites or somebody, somehow or another. Somewhere back in time was named Hinnom, and his sons were in control of this valley at some point in the distant past. So this is a valley outside Jerusalem, and there was a spot somewhere in this valley that was called Topheth, and it was a worship site where they had some kind of an altar to Baal or Molech, where they, with a furnace and with fire, and that's where they burned their sons and daughters. So the kings, and I don't know how widespread this was. The kings did it. We read about Ahaz did it back in the days of Isaiah 100 years ago. Manasseh did it. Amon would have done it for the 2 years he was around. They took their sons and daughters, their firstborn. I don't know how many of them they took. I don't know how many children that they had that they did this with. But they would put them in this furnace and burn them up. And they did that at a site called Topheth, which was in this valley. And this basis, this imagery of this altar where they burned up their babies, will serve as the basis for the imagery of hell. In fact, the name Valley of Ben Hinnom, when we get to the New Testament, is going to be translated Gehenna, which is a Greek, I guess, for translation of that same concept, sons of Hinnom. Ben Hinnom becomes Gehenna, and Gehenna is later translated in English as hell. So that is where the entire concept for hell, our visualization of hell comes from, is this spot in this valley outside Jerusalem where they originally built this worship site to Molech or whoever and burned their sons and daughters in the fire. We'll read about that when we get to Jeremiah. Jeremiah will have more to say about that. As of now, Josiah is desecrating that site so that future kings can't use it for that purpose. Josiah is not burning his sons and daughters there, but his predecessors have. And so he's trying to cleanse this site so that it can't be used for that purpose again. He removed from the entrance to the temple of the Lord the horses that the kings of Judah had dedicated to the sun. So they apparently had a team of horses that ran around the city or something, representing the suns moving around the earth every day. They were in the court. They were in the court near the room of an official named Nathan Melech. Josiah then burned the chariots dedicated to the sun. Apparently there was some sort of daily ritual where they would have the horses run around the city representing the sun being pulled across the earth. I guess. I don't really know. But they had a team of horses and chariots dedicated to the sun. He pulled down the altars of the kings of Judah had erected on the roof near the upper room of Ahaz, and the altars Manasseh had built in the two courts of the temple of the Lord. So even during Manasseh's own reforms, apparently he didn't do that. He removed them from there, smashed them to pieces, and threw the rubble into the Kidron Valley. The king also desecrated the high places that were east of Jerusalem, on the south of the hill of corruption. This ones Solomon, king of Israel, had built for Ashtoreth, the vile goddess of the Sidonians, for Chemosh, the vile god of Moab, and for Molech, the detestable god of the people of Ammon. So some of these have been around for a while. Some of these go back even to the days of Solomon. That would have been 300 plus. Solomon died in the year 930 BC. We're now into the 620s BC here. So we're 622 BC to be specific. So we're now over 300 years past. So he would have built these shrines at some point in the latter years of his reign. So sometime probably in the 930s BC. And so we're now, this was 300 years ago that some of these shrines have been standing here for. And Josiah is the one who finally brings them down. Josiah smashed the city. It also shows you just how long they had been putting up with some of this stuff. You know, some of these shrines have been standing there since the day. I don't know how often they were used. Maybe over the course of time, some of them have fallen out of favor. I don't know. We haven't heard them really mentioned very much since Solomon. But some of these, the fact that they've been there this whole time shows you that all throughout this time period, no matter how popular or how well used they were, these shrines have been standing there, and their very existence, being there this whole time, is testimony to the Judahites, lingering faithful, gradually reducing faithfulness to God. Josiah smashed the sacred stones and cut down the Asherah poles and covered the sites with human bones. He's doing that to desecrate these sites. He takes these unclean things, bones and ashes and things like that, and he's scattering them over these pagan worship sites to desecrate them so that they can't be used again. That's why he's doing it. In his mind, that's why he's doing that. It makes sense to him, and it would make sense to the people of that day why he's doing that, because that desecrates those sites. Now, presumably, some pagan priest could perform some kind of purification ritual and make those sites active again. Presumably, that could happen. I don't know if that did happen or not, but presumably a future pagan priest could just cleanse the site with his own ritual and act like it's clean again. I don't know, but Josiah is doing this in order to prevent these sites from being used again. as, shrines and altars to these pagan gods. Even the altar at Bethel, the high place made by Jeroboam, son of Nebat, who had caused Israel to sin, even that altar and high place he demolished. Remember, he was prophesied he was going to do this to Jeroboam's own face a long time ago. We'll read about that in a bit. We'll go back and read that in a second here. He burned the high place and ground it to powder, and burned the Asherah pole also. Then Josiah looked around, and when he saw all the tombs that were there in the hillside, he had the bones removed from them and burned on the altar to desecrate it, or to defile it, same thing, in accordance with the word of the Lord proclaimed by the man of God who had foretold these things. This goes back to the days of Jeroboam himself. We're going to have to go back and read this one. 1 Kings 13. Actually, let's start at the end of verse 12. First Kings chapter 12, starting in verse 25. This is after the split. The northern tribes have gone off of Jeroboam. The southern tribes and Benjamin, Judah and Benjamin, have stuck with Rehoboam. And for 1 Kings 12, starting in verse 25, then Jeroboam, the leader of the north, fortified Shechem in the hill country of Ephraim and lived there. From there he went out and built up Pethniel. Jeroboam thought to himself, the kingdom will now likely revert to the house of David. If these people go up to offer sacrifices at the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem, which is the only place at this point they're legally allowed to do it. Okay, all those high places they were building were no longer allowed. And previously they were tolerated, but they were no longer allowed. They had a sanctuary, they had the tabernacle. They always had that, but now they have a temple, a fixed stationary building that can't be moved around, like the previous tent, which could be moved around. They're supposed to bring all the sacrifices there. So these other high places and worship sites are no longer legal in their worship system. So to do worship God properly, they have to go to Jerusalem. And Jeroboam is not king in Jerusalem, Rehoboam is, and so he knows this is a problem for him. If these people go up to offer sacrifices at the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem, they will again give their allegiance to their lord Rehoboam, king of Judah. They will kill me and return to King Rehoboam. Now, after seeking advice, now he has a legitimate problem. I said this at the time when I read this. This is a legitimate problem because he's not wrong when everything he said there is accurate. He's not wrong when he says these things. This is a real problem he has on his hands. And God had said he was going to take the kingdom away from the son of Solomon, and he had even told Jeroboam previously he was going to give it to him. Now Jeroboam sought to take it by himself, but God had said that he was going to take the kingdom away from Solomon's son. He had said that he was going to give it to Jeroboam, and Jeroboam is accurate in knowing that he has a problem on his hands here. So he has a problem. But instead of turning to God for advice, and I have no idea what God's advice would have been to him or to any other future king of Israel, because none of them ever asked God for advice on what to do with his problem. Here's what he does instead. After seeking advice, clearly not from God, the king made 2 golden calves. He said to the people, it is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Here are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt. One he set up in Bethel, which is in the south of the country, and the other in Dan, which is the very north. And this thing became a sin. The people went even as far as Dan to worship the one there. Jeroboam built shrines in high places and appointed priests and all sorts of people, even though they were not Levites. He instituted a festival on the 15th day of the 8th month, like the festival held in Judah, which is in the 7th month, and offered sacrifices on the altar. So he's inventing his entire own worship system. This he did in Bethel, sacrificing the calves he had made. Now remember, the king and the high priest were not the same person. And they could not be the same person. The high priest came from the tribe of Levi, specifically the family of Aaron, and the king came from the tribe of Judah, specifically from the line of David. They could not be the same person. The 2 offices could not be united in the same individual. So the king was not allowed to perform the function of the high priest, and the high priest did not have the authority of the king. But in the nations around them at this point in time, it was very common for the same guy to do both things. The king and the high priest were very often the same dude. in the religion of the world at that time. And so here Jeroboam is acting as his own high priest. So he's making it his entire own worship system. This he did in Bethel, sacrificing to the calves he had made. And at Bethel he also installed priests at the high places he had made. On the 15th day of the 8th month, a month of his own choosing, he offered sacrifices on the altar he had built at Bethel. So he instituted the festival for the Israelites, and went up to the altar to make offerings. This is chapter 13 now. By the word of the Lord, a man of God came from Judah to Bethel, as Jeroboam was standing by the altar to make an offering. He cried out against the altar by the word of the Lord, O altar, altar, this is what the Lord says. A son named Josiah will be born to the house of David. This would be almost 300 years in the future. On you he will sacrifice the priests of the high places who now make offerings here, and human bones will be burned on you. That same day the man of God gave a sign. This is the sign the Lord has declared. The altar will be split apart, and the ashes on it will be poured out. When King Jeroboam heard what the man of God cried out against the altar at Bethel, he stretched out his hand from the altar and said, Seize him! But the hand he stretched out toward the man shriveled up, so that he could not pull it back. It became, weak and limp and shriveled up somehow. Also the altar was split apart, and its ashes poured out, according to the sign given by the man of God, by the word of the Lord. And then we have that strange story of this man of God going back to his hometown by a different route, and then meeting this guy from Samaria who deceived him and told him to come back with him and all that. Very strange story, but that's... Anyway, so this prophecy about this altar had been given in the days of Jeroboam himself, and that was 300 years earlier. And it's been a long time coming, but now someone is finally smashing Jeroboam's altar at Bethel. So back to 2 Kings 23, verse 15. Even the altar at Bethel, the high place made by Jeroboam son of Nebat, who had caused Israel to sin, even that altar and high place Josiah demolished. He burned the high place and ground it to powder, and burned the Asherah pole also. Then Josiah looked around, and when he saw the tombs that were on the hillside, he had the bones removed from them, presumably containing the priests that were on Jeroboam's side back in those days, and burned on the altar to defile it, in accordance with the word of the Lord, proclaimed by the man of God who foretold these things, which we just got done reading. The king asked, What is that tomb over there I see, that tombstone I see? The men of the city said, It marks the tomb of the man of God who came from Judah, and pronounced against the altar of Bethel the very things you have done to it. So that man's word ends up being proven right. Leave it alone, he said. Don't let anyone disturb his bones. So they spared his bones, and those of the prophet who had come from Samaria. That's the other guy in that story. You go back to 2 Kings 13, continue reading, and you read about this other guy from Samaria who deceived the original man of God into coming to his house, and that was against God's command. So that man of God is put to death, and then Samaria, and very strange story, but that's the other guy. So there's two guys in that story. Just as he had done at Bethel, Josiah removed and defiled all the shrines at the high places that the kings of Israel had built in the towns of Samaria that had provoked the Lord to anger. Josiah slaughtered all the priests of those high places on the altars and burned human bones on them. Then he went back to Jerusalem. The calf itself is long gone. The golden calf that used to be here has been gone at least since the Assyrian invasion 100 years earlier. We actually read about that in the book of Hosea, who was ministering to the north during its final days. All this flipping around can get kind of tricky. Oops. We read about that in the book of Hosea, who ministered to the north at that time. Hosea chapter 10, verse 5. The people who live in Samaria fear for the calf idol at Bethel. That's Bethel. Its people will mourn over it, and so will its idolatrous priests. those who had rejoiced over its splendor, because it is taken from them into exile. It will be carried to Assyria as tribute to the great king. So the golden calf that was at Bethel is not there any longer in the days of Josiah. It's been gone for at least 100 years. It's been gone at least since the days of the Assyrian invasion of Israel, which would have been 100 years before Josiah's time. There's also one in Dan, and we don't even know when that one disappeared. We didn't read about Josiah going as far north as Dan. So it could be that site's been gone for some time. I don't know what happened to that one. Now, this is probably happening during a time when Assyria, remember, this is the northern kingdom, the former northern kingdom of Israel, which was conquered by Assyria 100 years ago. But this is happening at a time when Assyria's power is weakening as they are losing the battle against Babylon. And so Assyria is not in a position to enforce its territory here and keep Josiah from going through the land of the north like this. So he has free reign to do this because there is not a powerful controlling force in this area as Assyria crumbles and Babylon has not yet extended its authority into this area. So this area is kind of like a no man's land at this point. You have a lot of these Assyrian descendants who were brought to settle here after the invasion and deportation. You have some of the original Israelites still living there, but their bloodlines are getting weaker as they're marrying off with these other people and becoming a mixed race. And there is no real controlling power any longer. The Assyrians had control of this area, but they are fading. The Babylonians had not yet made a move in this area, so Josiah now has an opportunity to do this, whereas he wouldn't have a few years earlier and won't have again a few years later.